As Julie said, my division issues experimental licenses. We do about 2,000 a year, and actually they're increasing every year, which is a good sign because we take it as a sign of innovation. The reasons you need an experimental license: either you want to operate in frequencies you don't otherwise have a right to operate in, or you want to operate in a way that's not permitted by the current regulations. It might be power levels, it might be a slightly different bandwidth, but our role is really to try to grant an experimental license. What I tell my people and what Julie tells us is that our role is to make the bar as low as possible that people can get an experimental license. We don't try to judge the application. Some of the applications that come in we think are great. Some of them that come in we think are crazy. And to be fair to the ones that sometimes the crazy ones turn out to be the great applications. So we try really to just to ensure that innovation occurs, and we think it's an important role that we support the granting of licenses. And it's, as I said, to promote innovation and research, product and service development, and also certain business processes. EMI testing, for example, where equipment has to be certified to be immune from radio frequencies. And we sometimes get into arguments with license holders over that right. One of my favorites was an incident we had with a military defense manufacturer that was testing a missile system for EMI testing, and the license holder objected to that, and they wanted us to notch out their frequencies. And the argument was, well, we really don't want a missile to go up with an agreement with the Chinese or the Russians that they won't try to jam at those frequencies. We really have to encourage. So a lot of what we do with experimental testing is to sort of balance interests between the license holders and the innovators. The process for those, and some of you I'm sure have gone through this, is you need to file for each experiment. You have to describe the purpose and operational characteristics, and we coordinate that with other bureaus. So each bureau, in effect, has a number of stakeholders that they support. So if you file an experimental license for cellular frequencies, it goes over to the Wireless Bureau. If you're filing for satellite frequencies, it goes over to the International Bureau. If you're filing for frequencies controlled by the federal government, it goes over to NTIA, and they adjudicate or coordinate the frequencies. And we look at it in terms of potential for harmful interference to existing stakeholders, because the one limitation of an experimental license is you can't cause interference to licensed stakeholders. The license is granted for periods of 6 months, 2 years, and 5 years. I've actually been pushing back on 5 years. That's a long grant, and we're much more comfortable, especially in this environment where everything's changing so rapidly, of doing this 6 months and 2 years at a time. And once you get a license, if you need to renew it, a 2-year license is a fairly easy process. We can attach conditions to ensure minimal impact. We might have to limit power levels. We might have geographic limitations that we apply to a license. So that's part of the coordination process. And on average, a license takes 4 to 6 weeks to grant. Okay, although it's not quite a bell-shaped curve. The horror stories have gone to 6 months to 9 months where there are tenacious issues that need to be adjudicated. One that took about 4 months involved a researcher that wanted to measure polar ice cap depth, and they were going over a range of federal frequencies, and the federal side supported it, but it was a very complex coordination process to ensure that they could fly an airplane across a wide area and not interfere with federal operations. So sometimes the granting gets very complex. The problem is that each experiment requires a separate license, and a lot of innovators are serial offenders. A lot of innovators basically will do many experiments. Universities, for example, are companies that focus on R&D. They do experiments serially, and for each license, it's a separate application. Also, some institutions may not be familiar with the application process, and this is something that's been one of Julie's soapboxes, is that we ought to make things easier for universities, and they often don't have the expertise, or they lack tribal knowledge. A company has people who focus and specialize on the licensing process. Universities, the staff floats much more frequently, so you might lose that institutional knowledge. And the other thing that we often do is we apply, for safety purposes, we apply typically a seek consent of license holder condition. Often goes on a license, or a coordination goes on a license, that requires the license applicant to contact specific stakeholders. That can be a single stakeholder, or it can be dozens of stakeholders. And that can be a very onerous process for some institutions. About 4 or 5 years ago, I guess more like 5 years ago, we started talking about trying to streamline the process for the centers of innovation, and recognizing that many R&D institutions control the space in which the experiment occurs. So the standard process makes no assumptions about whether or not you control we look at the space that you're proposing to do the experiment in, and then apply a coordination process. But it was noted that many universities, R&D institutions, have facilities where they do 99% of the work, 99% of the experiments occur on space that they control. And we came up with a concept called a program license that grants a general authority to conduct experiments in a defined geographic area. So the idea was you're the master of your own domain, that if you control the space, you should have a lot more flexibility in terms of experiments you do within that geographic area. And what we decided that we would change the process. Instead of having a process where you seek approval to do an experiment, we would have a process where you would post what you're going to do. And if nobody objects to that, then you've got permission to do it. So it starts with a grant of a general authority to conduct experiments in a defined geographic area. So an institution would apply for a program license and be granted a program license, provided they met certain criteria in terms of being a valid R&D institution. Okay, then they would describe their experiment and post on an FCC program license website. The website permits inspection by the public and automatic notification by triggers on experimental characteristics to interested parties. So if you're a licensed stakeholder, you can go to our website, you can put in some criteria, our future website, I should say, put in some criteria, and if anybody posts an experiment that meets that criteria, they would be notified. If no objections are received within a 10-day period, you're good to go, or a 15-day period for federal frequencies. So the whole idea is to allow people to easily post what they want to do, not have to go through this interactions in terms of contacting each potentially affected party and describing what they're going to do, seeking consent or coordinating, but simply post it on their website, and if there's no objection, they're free to operate within the geographic area that was granted for the program license. And finally, and this is important to us, and we some proceedings, this is very important to us, you need to report on the experiment, including any interference incidents, within 30 days of the experiment termination. So this is not this is a quid pro quo, basically. Do the experiment, but give us some information in terms of the results of the experiment. Our expectation is going to be lower overhead per experiment for the application, certainly a streamlining of the process. And the other important part is that potentially affected parties first must self-identify, and then they must also file an objection for cause. In the current process, seeking consent can start with simply the stakeholder saying, I'm not going to give consent. Okay, and by the way, that is a rare event, but I can tell you, if that happens, we got a long road to go down. So, so this is a basic paradigm shift. Presumptive right to proceed subject to valid objections for cause. And again, the prior experimenter had to seek stakeholders and negotiate for permission. The stakeholders could range from one party to many. In fact, just as one example, Sprint leases 2.5 gigahertz spectrum from, that was an educational set-aside. So, in fact, this university probably has a 2.5 gigahertz license. If somebody proposing to do an experiment on 2.5 gigahertz typically has to contact just about every educational institution in the area because they're still the license holder. Okay. So what remains? You still have an obligation to avoid creation of harmful interference. So even if you have a program license, even if you're granted the right to do an experiment, if somebody objects because of interference, you have to stop that experiment. And you have to, another characteristic of an experimental license, you can't complain about other people interfering with your experiment. So you have to accept. An experimental license always requires you to accept whatever interference is required. And that's what Julie alluded to earlier, that we're giving out sharing licenses that do offer protection. So it's not really unlicensed. We have a light license that allows people to share spectrum, but gives certainty in terms of interference rights. Who is eligible? We really came up with this for colleges and universities with a graduate research program in engineering that is accredited by the ABET. Any valid research laboratory, any hospital or healthcare institution, any manufacturer of radio frequency equipment, or a manufacturer that integrates radio frequency equipment into its end product. So if you're a company making products, a university doing research, a health institution, okay, you're entitled to file for a grant for license. Okay, what are the obligations of the license? You have to limit it to within the geographic area that you applied for. Okay, you have to have an institutional processes to manage a wide variety of research projects. So one of the criteria we'll judge you on. You've demonstrated expertise in radio spectrum. So we've already had at least one filing from an individual, one request from an individual that would want to apply for a program license. That doesn't meet the criteria that we've established. And you have to establish a geographic area that is inclusive of your own property. You can't say, I'm going to do this in New York City. Okay, you have to restrict it to a geographic facility that you can exercise control over. It could be a building, but it has to be a facility that you control. Okay, it requires when it's not permitted. Okay, if you have to do an environmental assessment, if you have an orbital debris mitigation plan, which excludes just about all satellite applications, where the applicant requires non-disclosure of proprietary information. So if you're doing something that's confidential from a business perspective, you want to protect that, this is not the license for you. Or where you want to do a product development or a market trial is to be conducted. So that's to be done for research. We also have a medical testing license. I think I'm going to skip over this other than saying it's roughly equivalent to the program license with some slight alignments due to the nature of the industry. And this is something I want to talk about. The other thing we noted is that there might be collaborative research enterprises done in an area that isn't technically controlled by the research participants. We started thinking about this when people started tossing around the term model city. So we declared something to be an innovation zone. An innovation zone is a specified geographic location. It has pre-authorized boundary conditions. So whoever declares, we would work with institutions in defining an innovation zone. But the innovation zone would have boundary conditions such as frequency bands you could do innovation in, maximum power, etc. We create this by the Commission on its own motion or response to a request from the public. So, for example, the NSF could make a request to create an innovation zone, and we would work with the NSF in terms of establishing the parameters of that zone, including the geography. And they would be announced via public notice and posted on the Commission's Program Experimental Registration website. So an innovation zone basically is a program license where the requirement to actually own and control the facility by a specific institution is relaxed. In all other respects, it's a program license from an innovator's perspective. Okay, you still have to have a program license, so you should apply for a program license, but you can define the area that you want to operate in as the innovation zone. Okay, and again, the same conditions apply. The experiments are bounded by the boundary conditions of the geographic area that you're going to operate in. Okay, now just give a status update. This has been a long process. We've had this going on for 5 years. We needed funding from Congress to do the website development. That's an ugly process I'm not going to talk about in terms of how we got the money, how working with the vendors. We've reached a milestone on the project where we've completed internal work on the website. We're about to move towards some external third-party testing. And I would expect that in January we'll be releasing a public notice announcing this. So we're very close to completing a long journey we started, 5 years ago. Okay, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for that information. It was very useful. I have a question about the program license.
Yes.
When you say research lab, does it also apply to industrial research labs to use on their campus or in a building around their campus?
Yeah, industrial research labs can apply for it. There are some restrictions in terms of what it can be used for. Can't be used for market trials, can't be used for ongoing product development. It has to support research, so new product development.
Thank you.
So I asked this yesterday, but I guess I will, he told me to wait till today. So millimeter wave signals interact much differently with the human body, and there's also been an increase in the EIRP for portable devices. So how do you think they're going to be regulated for EM exposure?
Yeah, why don't you take that? He gets the hard ones.
So there are standards that apply in terms of the SAR, so we'll apply that. And there are, I think, some novel questions that we're trying to grapple with relative to how do you do the measurements, in part because of with the adaptive array technologies, exactly the averaging area, how do you do that? Whether you should do, how do you apply time averaging and so forth. So I think on the measurement side is where we're still kind of doing some work. We work closely as well with FDA, and so anything that we do, we coordinate with them. And it's still early on, but we're aware that we need to do a little bit more work on the testing side.
Well, yeah, this was really useful information about the licenses. I know that we've had a couple of. So, is this a new process? Are you going to be updating? Because we've had a couple of times we've had licenses, but I would say it's kind of cryptic. It doesn't work, and you're like scratching your head why it didn't work, and then every time it did go through right, we'd be like, yes, somehow we did it right. So, I would say, but. I encourage you. I think a lot of experimental researchers don't know that they can. It's a relatively straightforward process, but it's a way that's going to be extremely
The real issue here is you should have a right to experiment unless somebody objects. Okay? And we're trying to get out of the process where you've got to seek consent to do something. Big companies can deal with that. They've got a whole host of people they can assign to do these tasks. We know it's a problem for universities and smaller research institutions. We think this will streamline it. We think it will cut down the effort. And the first time through might be a little bit confusing, but we think that the process itself is fairly streamlined and simpler than what we have right now.
Questions? All right, well, great.
Yeah, thank you. Walter's going to hang around. I've got to get back. So if you do have other questions later, you may be able to help me out.
Thank you so much. Let's.